Chapter 1 goes over a variety of topics, including some historical perspective on sexuality, how it's been viewed clinically, especially the topic of homosexuality, looking at Freud's view of it, as well as others. And also it goes over the various perspectives researchers take toward studying sexuality. Sociologists, for example, examine sexuality by conducting surveys and examining how society at large impacts sexual behavior, sexual trends as they change over time. The feminist perspective often focuses on women and their sexuality. Notice these two things often go hand in hand. Sociocultural influences on women's sexuality, what is considered sexy, social cultural influences on what behavior is appropriate for women. You will see feminists very often finding social causes and social influences on behavior, probably a little more so than biological. The book points out researchers often point more to social influences in describing women's sexuality and biological influences describing males. We can also take an evolutionary approach in examining traits that may exist in either genders and how they are expressed and why they are there in the first place. We may, for example, look at differences in jealousy. Lately there's been some really interesting research in evolutionary psych. It combines both the social influences and the biological influences. Sometimes it's been criticized for being a little too biological. Sometimes, often it's been criticized for being very post hoc. I myself, I lean toward a evolutionary perspective because it does combine a lot of the biological and social influences. One of the core things I keep saying I want you to get out of the class is a richer understanding that both things are at play. If you think about it, if some trait has existed for a long time and is cross-cultural, it may end up establishing itself in our genetic code. The environmental influences often dictate over time what traits are most adaptive. We see this in physical strength. Men were typically the hunters. They would go out, so they would have killing animals or unfortunately each other. They'd have to then be bigger and stronger, whereas women were more caretakers. And this helps explain why we see the physical differences in men and women in terms of strength, height, and some other attributes. We can also see this probably in personality characteristics like how jealousy is expressed, as well as some cognitive influences. The book points out differences in mental rotation tasks, object identification, and complex scene. Chapter 4 goes over some gender differences. I'm not going to talk much about the physiology of the differences. You could definitely review that in the book. What I will talk about is the biological and social influences that determine people's behavior. There are definitely some social influences. Fathers are more concerned about their sons being heterosexual than women. Males tend to encourage more rough and tumble play in boys than women do, and buy gender-appropriate toys. However, notice there is some evidence that there are already inherent differences between boys and girls in their toy choice. Boys without social influence tend to pick guns to play with and cars, and girls choose to play with dolls and more domestic things. We even see this in monkeys. So a purely social model, I believe, really can't account for these differences. Monkeys aren't socialized to play, boy monkeys aren't socialized by their fathers to play with cars, and girl monkeys aren't socialized by their mothers or fathers to play with dolls. It seems to be a natural toy preference. This may also feed into some evidence to support the notion of a biological component to homosexuality. We see that some girls, if they're exposed to too much androgen in the womb, tend to develop more masculine traits. Notice when we talk about biological influences, again, it doesn't have to be genetic. There's a substantial line of research pointing to hormonal influences inside the womb influencing sexual development and secondary sexual characteristics. By secondary sexual characteristics, I mean sexual orientation or sexual preferences. The data suggests that exposure to certain androgens may influence sexual orientation. This obviously aren't the only causes, but there seems to be a fair amount of evidence. Later on, when we talked about sexual orientation, we'll talk about some of the signs for gaydar, and is there actually any truth behind some of those attributes.